Good morning. The story of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego and the fiery furnace is one of my favourite stories in the whole of the Bible. It's great to read out loud, and I love the way that the repetition helps to create and build suspense. So you've got the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates and all the other provincial officials. And then later on you've got the horns, flutes, zithers, lyres, harps, pipes and all kinds of musical instruments. You've got the contrast in the story of the supposedly all-powerful, all-conquering king with all his personal insecurities. And then on the other hand, we have the quiet confidence of these supposedly powerless exiled slaves. There's the faith of these three men. Our God can deliver us from your hand, but their allegiance and their obedience is to their God, whatever might happen. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to do what you say. Then there is their miraculous rescue, with God joining them in the fire, and then Nebuchadnezzar feeling the need that this all-powerful God might somehow need his help and protection, just in case someone might say something that will upset him. It is such a great story. It's the sort of story that when it comes up as a primary school assembly topic, I don't need to go and check whether it's included in the Lion Storyteller Bible. Of course it is. It's such a great story. It has everything. Each autumn, we've been working our way through the Old Testament story of the people of Israel. And generally speaking, on one level, it's a pretty depressing story. Often we've picked out the best bits and we've jumped over the worst bits. But if you were to sit down and to read through the whole thing, you'd be forgiven for asking, when will the people ever learn? The story started off so well. There was this marriage between God and the people of Israel. He'd rescued them from Egypt. He'd laid out the terms and conditions, and the people had pledged their allegiance to God. They'd chosen to follow him, and in turn God had promised to bless them. And the basics of the agreement were laid out in the Ten Commandments, starting with these instructions. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image, and you shall not bow down to them or worship them. And what we find is that for story after story after story, for individual after individual after individual, we find God's people chasing after foreign gods, bowing down to them, worshipping them, and serving them. Every other nation was supposed to look at Israel and to see what it meant to be in a covenant relationship with the living God, and they were supposed to see that. And they were supposed to say, well, we want to know this God too. Instead, Israel spent all of the time looking at everyone else and wanting to be like them and to worship their gods. And so time after time, the people turned their backs on the living God, the God who'd rescued them from Pharaoh, who brought them into the promised land. And instead, they'd made statues out of wood and out of stone and out of metal, and they'd bowed down and served these idols. And as we saw last year, as a consequence, as God had promised, the people are now in exile. They've been ejected from the land that God had given them. And so Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego find themselves living in a land where foreign gods are worshipped, where God's laws aren't even on the radar, where all of the people, all of the time, are eating food that would never be allowed in Israel. There's no celebration of the Sabbath. There's no day of rest put aside each week. And so the question comes, have they learnt yet? Are they going to listen to God now? What is going to happen when Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego face their test? What is going to happen when they face that choice? Have no other gods before me. As we saw 2 weeks ago when we looked at chapter 1, these 3 men, along with Daniel, made a stand on day 1. On day 1, they pledged their allegiance to God. They started off as they meant to go on. My reading of the story is that when they heard what was supposed to happen when all these musical instruments played, they took the decision not to be a part of this. And so they were probably just somewhere else. Because this matter is only brought to Nebuchadnezzar's attention by some of the wise men who've recently experienced Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego being promoted ahead of them and over them. Professional jealousy seems to be their motive. It doesn't look as if Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego had taken a particularly vocal or public stand against the building and the worship of this idol. Instead, they'd quietly resolved that they were not going to worship it. They were not going to be a part of all of this. They were not going to be involved. Now, we live in a culture where we're probably not going to be asked to bow down before a golden statue which has been set up on, say, the Combatant Wreck. The foreign gods of our culture are a lot more subtle than that. The theologian Paul Tillich says, "A person's God is the thing or person that one is most concerned about, thinks the most about, or affects one's life the most." I don't know about you, but I find that a very challenging definition. There are certainly a lot of potential candidates that could very easily slip into God's place. If you think back to the beginning of the first lockdown in March 2020, it was certainly a very challenging time for lots of people. But there were also stories of how people were more engaged with God, and a part of that was simply the fact that many of the distractions of everyday life had been taken away. Many of the things that we fill our time with were simply not there anymore. The things that mean that we don't have time to read the Bible or to pray each day or meet with other Christians on a regular basis, they simply weren't on offer. And so I suppose that one of the questions for us now that many of these things are taking place again, is have we allowed these things to squeeze God out once again? Were we closer to God in the lockdown simply because there was nothing else to do? But now, these other gods, gods of family, work, ambition, money, status, hobbies, sport, once again, these are things that we're most concerned about. These are the things that we think the most about. These are the things that impact our lives the most. And it's not that we need to kick up a fuss about these things, but often, like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, we simply need to choose to be somewhere else. When everyone else is headed towards the plain of Dura, we simply need to be heading in a different direction, because our priorities are different, our allegiances are different, our God is different. But Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego don't go unnoticed for long. Their unwillingness to fit in and go along with everyone else has made them a target for disgruntled work colleagues. And this is an ideal opportunity to drop them right in it. And as kind of an aside, I think it is worth noting that the unwanted attentions of disgruntled work colleagues is a potential hazard that we face as Christians at work, when you don't necessarily get involved in everything that everyone else is doing, when you value integrity and honesty, when you don't get involved in the office gossip, when you're prepared to come alongside the outsider. These are all the sorts of things that can very easily mark us out for unwanted attention. And that's certainly what seems to have happened here to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And now it's no longer simply a case of being somewhere else. Now they're faced with a choice with serious consequences. Bow down and worship, or get thrown into the fiery furnace. We saw in chapter 1 that so far Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego have taken a stand on some issues, not eating food from the king's table, for example, but not on every issue. Presumably they were being trained in Babylonian occult practices. But here they're faced with a situation where there can be no compromise, the worship of a foreign god. And so they say no. Whatever the cost, the answer is no. Again, our gods are a lot more subtle. But when we are faced with situations where we're being asked to put someone or something other than God in God's place, am I prepared to say no, no matter what the cost? Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego all know that God is capable of saving them. But that didn't mean that God would. And they weren't taking this stand because they knew it would be all right on the night. They took this stand because it was the right thing to do. And even if God didn't save them, they would still not worship Nebuchadnezzar's God. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego knew what it meant to be a slave. Humanly speaking, their lives literally rested in the hand of someone else. But they also knew that they were slaves of the living God. They were in God's hands, and therefore God would do whatever he wanted. You know, sometimes I think we think that we can twist God's arm. I'll do this and then God will do that. Or we follow a particular course of action and then wonder why things don't work out exactly the way that we imagined they would. Or we bargain with God. If you do this, then, and only then, I will do that. And yet in their response to Nebuchadnezzar, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego show that they have faith in what could do, but their allegiance and obedience is not based on what God will do for them. It's based on remaining faithful to their God, obedient to their God, whatever the consequences might be. 2 weeks ago when Mark was leading, he talked about the story of Jim Elliot and his 4 friends, Ed, Roger, Pete and Nate, 5 young missionaries who went with the good news of Jesus into the forests of Ecuador to make contact with a specific unreached tribe. And these 5 men were killed by the tribe on one of their first attempts to make contact with them. And one of Jim Elliot's most famous quotes says, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." Will they ever learn? Is something that we could say over and over again as we read the story of God's people from Genesis onwards. God has promised them life in all its fullness, if only they would remain faithful to him. But time and again, their heads are turned and they serve other gods. And yet God has proved himself to be faithful. God has proved himself to be gracious, to be patient, to be forgiving, and to be merciful. And now finally in Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, we appear to have 3 young men who pass the test. They remain faithful to God, even if it will cost them their lives. Perhaps one of the reasons we don't ask the question, will they ever learn more than we do? Is because, at least I know speaking for myself, it's a question that can very easily be asked of me. Will I ever learn? Yet we know that our heads are often turned and we chase after things which then become more important to us than God. But God is faithful. God is gracious. He is loving. He is patient. He is forgiving. And He is merciful. When we mess it up, God invites us to confess our mistakes, and He promises that He will forgive us. And we get a chance to go again. So let's not just enjoy this story as a great story, although it certainly is a great story. Let us this week allow this story to challenge us. Let's make sure that there are no golden images that we are bowing down to, people or things which have taken God's place. And if there are, then let's confess that to our loving Heavenly Father, believing and trusting that He forgives us. And let us resolve that no matter what the cost, we won't, in the words of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, we won't serve your gods and we won't worship the image of gold that you have set up.